The wastes are never entirely silent. Even at dusk, when the winds slow and the sky folds itself into muted bands of violet and rust, there is always a low sound, a hum, a drift, a shifting of dust across stone. Against that endless backdrop of quiet movement, there are rare moments when the eye catches something more deliberate, something not born of accident, but of intention. On the threshold of a ruined chapel, its roof half gone, its walls bowed outward with time, there rests such a sign, a lantern. Its casing is dented, its handle worn to the dull shine of iron, touched many times by steady hands. The glass is cracked in two places, patched with resin, yet it holds a flame. A small wick, floating in oil, scavenged from somewhere, burns with a yellow-orange glow. It is not the brightest light in the wastes. A fire in a barrel burns louder. A sunset on an unclouded horizon blazes stronger. But this lantern hums softly, like a heartbeat one can trust. It is an object of competence, a tool maintained, adjusted, kept alive day after day. Inside the chapel, a figure moves slowly among benches that do not match. Some are split from old pews. Some are scavenged shipping pallets, nailed into rough seats. Others are only stumps of wood, dragged in from nearby trees long dead. The figure does not arrange them into strict rows. Instead, they are spread in a circle around the lantern's glow, as if to invite company that has not yet arrived. The cleric, though one hesitates to call them that in the old world sense, kneels and dusts the boards with a rag. Dust gathers again immediately, carried in through the broken walls, but the motion is what matters. It is a ritual, a way of saying this space is tended. Even when empty, it is not abandoned. Outside, the wastes stretch in every direction. The chapel stands on a rise, where long ago a road must have curved upward toward a settlement. Now only fragments remain, rusting guardrails bent into the soil, a scattering of cracked asphalt leading nowhere. Yet from this vantage, travelers crossing the horizon can see the lantern, a low, steady glow that says, "There is a place to rest if you are weary." The cleric finishes dusting and sets the rag aside. They check the lantern, steadying the wick with a practiced hand, topping the oil with a small bottle kept hidden under the altar. Oil is not easy to find, but somehow there is always enough. Perhaps scavenged, perhaps traded. It is never explained. And maybe it does not need to be. When the task is complete, the figure sits back against the broken wall, listening. No congregation arrives tonight. Perhaps none will tomorrow. But the lantern is lit all the same. This is how the story of the last clergy begins, not with miracles, not with thunder, but with the simplest gesture of care, repeated over and over, until it becomes a symbol. Travelers speak of it in passing. A caravan leader once told his guards, "If you see the glow from that hill, you'll know we've walked far enough for tonight." Another survivor remembered, years later, how the lantern seemed brighter on nights when storms tore across the flats. They never saw who lit it. They never asked. It was enough to know it was there. Such fragments of recollection form the first open question of this story. Who began this tending? Was it one person or many across time? Did the lantern's light belong to a faith or only to a habit that grew into meaning? No one claims certainty. The answers are scattered, carried like whispers between travelers who pass too quickly to confirm details. The chapel itself is no grand monument. Its stones are weathered, its floor uneven. Grass has begun to push through the cracks, pale and dry. Yet in the care taken to place each bench, to sweep the dust even briefly, there is a suggestion that the building is not forgotten, not wholly, in the way pre-war people might have said, but something adjacent, a held space. As dusk deepens, the lantern's glow is mirrored faintly in the cleric's eyes. They are not young, but not yet frail. Their clothing is patched, robe-like, more by accident than design. The figure hums softly, not a hymn, but a simple melody carried from memory. A tune repeated to keep time while working, to calm the breath, to anchor thought. It lingers in the air, long after the voice falls silent. For some, this image, a lantern glowing in the hollow of ruins, is enough. They will remember it for years, retelling the sight as though it was rarer than it truly was. For others, the glow is only background, a small comfort passed without notice. Both perspectives are true, and neither diminishes the act of tending. The lantern becomes motif, a thread that connects those who see it to those who will one day tell of it. When the flame gutters, someone will steady it. When the wick burns low, someone will trim it. The continuity is more important than the identity of the hands that keep it alive. This is the beginning of the saints of the wastes, not crowned or canonized, but remembered through gestures so ordinary that they endure. And yet, even in this calm tableau, questions linger. Who were the first to call themselves clergy after the bombs? What voices shaped the early words that gave rhythm to this kind of care? Did they come from old world churches, or did they simply step forward when silence felt heavier than song? The lantern glows as if holding the answers in its hum, but it will not speak them tonight. Instead, it waits as dusk softens into night and the winds begin to settle. This opening image is only the first page of the story. In the next, we will follow the traces of memory backward. We will gather voices, half remembered, imperfect, of the first survivors who carried fragments of hymns, who marked safe wells with symbols, who sang to children in darkened places. Their words and deeds will reveal how the lantern came to be more than a lamp. But for now, the night belongs to the glow itself. The lantern burns, the chapel waits, and the wastes, never entirely silent, hush themselves around the steady hum of a flame tended with care. The lantern's glow lingers in memory, but every light must have a beginning. To understand how a single flame came to stand as a beacon in the wasteland, we step backward into recollections, into voices that were never written down, but carried forward on the breath of survivors. They are fragments. They are scattered, yet together they form a pattern, like the faint outlines of constellations, visible only when one looks long enough into the night. The first clergy of the post-war world were not always clergy at all. Some had studied in seminaries before the bombs, yes, but many more were ordinary people who simply found themselves holding roles once filled by others. In the first days after the firestorms, when skies were red and ash fell like snow, survivors huddled in basements and tunnels. They had no food, little water, and less certainty. Yet someone always seemed to speak first. Someone always seemed to say, "We can stay here together until morning." Perhaps that was the first sermon. No thunder, no scripture, only the reassurance of a steady voice in the dark. A merchant, long afterward, remembered a woman in a ruined schoolhouse who gathered the children together. She had once been a teacher, not a priest. Her hymnals had burned with the library, but she sang old songs from memory, soft and halting, until the children joined her. Later generations would recall her as the Song Mother, though she never gave herself such a name. Her role was not chosen, only discovered. Elsewhere, an aging man walked the cracked streets of a city whose name had been lost to time. He carried a Bible, torn and singed, many of its pages unreadable. But what he did with it was not preaching. He used it as a map. In the margins were notes he had once written about his neighborhood, about safe wells and shops. Those notes became more valuable than the words of prophecy. Survivors followed him not for his doctrine, but for his memory, and in time they called him the Shepherd. Both of these figures were remembered for what they did more than what they believed. That is the thread we begin to trace. Faith as practice, faith as competence, faith as small gestures repeated. Travellers on old trade routes passed on still other recollections. A woman who marked clean wells with chalk crosses, a man who carried candles in his pack and left them behind at crossroads, unlit but ready for the next traveller, a youth who drew simple symbols on cave walls, not to frighten but to assure, someone has been here before you. Were these people clergy? Not in the way the pre-war world would define the term. They had no vestments, no churches, no formal ordination. Yet their presence carried something that others recognized. When they spoke, people felt steadier. When they sang, silence felt less heavy. When they acted, even in simple tasks, the atmosphere shifted from survival to continuity. It is possible that none of these early voices knew one another. They lived scattered across ruined landscapes, days or weeks apart by foot. But their gestures resonated in similar ways, and as generations passed, the echoes of their actions converged into a collective memory that later survivors would name the Saints of the Wastes. Around settlement fires, these stories were retold in fragments. An old caravan guard remembered the shepherd, but described him as younger than he ever could have been. A settler in another town claimed the songmother had walked through their ruins, though no one else recalled her. Inconsistencies abound. But rather than discrediting the tales, the differences only made them more enduring. Each teller reshaped the figure to reflect what their community most needed to believe. This act of remembering is itself a ritual. Words, even if imperfect, are preserved by the intention behind them. And so, the memory of the first clergy is not a fixed truth, but a tapestry, stitched together by countless hands across decades. The lantern at the chapel door becomes clearer now. It was not one person's invention, nor the legacy of a single leader. It was an echo, a gesture born from many who came before, each tending something small, a hymn, a well, a mark, a flame. Someone, perhaps centuries later, placed a lantern at a doorway, and travelers recognized in its glow the accumulated pattern of all those earlier acts. This is the way of the wastes. No one remembers the exact beginning, but they remember the feeling of being steadied, and they preserve it by repetition. One account, told in hushed tones in a desert settlement, recalls a figure who refused to name themselves at all. Survivors knew them only by their hands. They would arrive at camps quietly, tend the fire, mend torn fabric, and leave again, without speaking more than a few words. They were remembered not for their voice, but for their touch, their competence in repairing what others thought broken beyond use. In the telling, those hands became symbols, hands that did not destroy, hands that made whole. Another remembered story tells of a cleric who prayed not aloud but through writing. On fragments of scavenged metal, they etched single words: hope, water, stay, rest. These fragments were found decades later in abandoned places. The words rusted, but still legible. Some believed they carried luck, and they were kept in pouches like talismans. Others dismissed them as nothing more than scratched metal. But the persistence of those etchings suggests an intent that cannot be dismissed outright. In both examples, the details blur across retellings. Were these truly separate figures, or the same individual told differently? No, one can be certain. But the uncertainty is not a weakness. It allows the memory to expand, to be shared across more voices. The lantern at dusk, then, is both literal and symbolic. Literal in that someone did tend it, carefully, day after day. Symbolic in that it represents the continuity of all those unnamed figures whose presence calmed, whose gestures steadied. Tonight, the cleric in the ruined chapel may feel alone. Their benches remain empty, their hymn hummed without reply. Yet outside, travellers whisper of the glow. Children are soothed by the stories of saints who carried chalk or candles or songs. The act of tending becomes amplified, magnified, carried far beyond the walls of stone. It is enough. In time, these stories would not only comfort, but also inspire. If the first clergy could tend with so little, then surely others could do the same. From this seed grows the next step, the reclaiming of spaces. Barns turned into chapels, subway alcoves made into sanctuaries. The idea that ruins could be arranged not only for survival, but also for meaning. That is where we will go next. From the first voices to the first spaces, from song to shelter. From the lantern's glow to the chapels among ruins. For now, though, we let the voices linger, scattered, partial, half-remembered, yet steady. They are not complete, but they do not need to be. The pattern is visible enough if you look at it gently, as one looks at constellations. The stars are far apart, but together they form a picture. And so, we close this chapter with a breath held softly, the lantern still burning in memory, and the voices drifting forward like wind through stone, carrying us toward the next step in the story. The world after the Great War is a world of rivers without masters. Once, each flowing line of water belonged to a nation, or to a company, or to a dam that controlled its strength. After the fire fell, the rivers slipped their chains. They carved new paths through shattered valleys. They rose above broken bridges. They sank beneath the weight of dust and ash. In this chapter, we drift beside one such river. It is not named on any modern map. Its banks are empty of towns, though old road signs point the way to settlements that no longer stand. Some of its tributaries have dried into pale scars in the soil, while others run darker, as if carrying the memory of what the land endured. The Vault 76 survivors came here in their second year. They followed the water downstream, not out of hunger, but out of instinct. For in the Wasteland, rivers hold stories, and stories are as vital as food. From the ridge above, the river gleamed like a ribbon dropped by the hands of the sky. At sunrise, the fog bent low, turning its surface into a mirror that carried the light of a weak and broken sun. It was not a wide river, not the kind to swallow armies, but it had strength enough to pull itself forward, endlessly, into the unknown. The settlers watched it for a long time before stepping down. They listened to the sound, gentle and constant, a language older than bombs and empires. Some swore they could hear it speaking, not in words, but in rhythm, the heartbeat of something still alive in a world where so much else had died. One of them, a teacher named Mara, said softly, "Where there is running water, there is hope." Rivers do not surrender. They simply change their course. Her words lingered. They did not sound like a command, nor like a prophecy. They sounded like the truth of the land itself. Yet rivers also remember. When the bombs fell, firestorms rolled through the valley, and the river became a carrier of ash. It swallowed blackened soil, fragments of houses, melted glass. For weeks it ran dark, like a wound that bled without end. Fish perished in droves, and their bones lined the banks. Children once played along its shores, but their laughter had been silenced in a single day. Only the current endured, pulling fragments of the old world away, burying them beneath silt. Some survivors spoke of nights when the water reflected not the stars, but faces, faces of those who had stood on its banks long ago. Of course, such tales cannot be measured nor tested. But in the hush of the wasteland, when the wind dies and the world grows still, it is easy to believe that rivers, too, carry ghosts. The vault dwellers set camp by the river's bend. They raised simple shelters, not out of ambition, but because the sound of water gave them rest. At night, its constant movement drowned the silence of ruined hills. In the morning, mist rose and wrapped their camp in a veil of calm. They fished, though at first the catch was meager. The fish were thin, brittle things, shaped by years of poisoned flow. But over time, the river offered more. Mutations appeared, strange yet edible. Fish with scales that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Fish with eyes too large, as if watching both past and future. They learned which to eat and which to release. The river fed them in body, but more importantly, it fed them in spirit. To live beside moving water is to remember that the world still holds motion, still holds music, still holds a path that does not end at ruin. Downstream, they found a bridge, or what remained of one. The supports still held, blackened but upright. The surface had collapsed into the current, leaving only twisted girders and fragments of stone. Children climbed upon the wreckage and declared it their fort. Elders stood and watched, seeing not a playground, but a monument. For bridges are symbols. They speak of connection, of journeys made possible, of one shore reaching to another. Now the bridge was broken, but even broken, it stood as reminder. Humanity once built such things. Humanity could build again. The settlers began leaving small offerings here. A carved piece of wood, a polished stone, a letter folded into glass and dropped into the current. Not as worship, but as recognition that this place remembered and deserved remembrance. At night, the river sang, not in melody, but in repetition, the endless chorus of water meeting stone, of ripples folding into ripples. Survivors learned to sleep by that song. Some said it reminded them of lullabies before the war. Others said it was like a heartbeat, soft and unending. One night, Mara, the teacher, told the children a story. She said rivers were the world's first memory. Long before people, long before vaults and bombs, the land itself remembered by carving lines of water. She told them each river was like a book, written not in ink, but in movement, and that by listening, one could read it. The children lay close, eyes heavy, as the water carried her words away, folding them into its endless journey. Further down, the settlers found a place where the river widened. Here, the land had once held a town. Streets now lay beneath shallow water. Rooftops jutted from the surface like teeth. Signs clung to poles, half drowned, rust spelling words that no longer had meaning. The settlers waded carefully. Beneath the surface, they saw the remains of doorways, windows, and cars. An entire life swallowed. Some swore they could still hear bells beneath the current, as if the town had not accepted its fate. Others said the river had claimed it gently, like a blanket over the dead. The children asked if people had survived. The elders answered carefully, perhaps. But whether they did or not, the river holds them now. And in holding, it remembers. The settlers did not linger long. The drowned town felt too heavy, too sorrowful. But they left flowers upon its surface, watching as the petals floated away, carried into silence. The survivors came to understand something simple. Rivers do not rush. They are patient. They carve stone not with violence, but with persistence. They carry entire histories not in haste, but in time. In the wasteland, where desperation urged people to hurry, always hurry, to eat, to defend, to rebuild, the river offered another lesson, that some things must be allowed to unfold slowly. That survival was not only about endurance, but about waiting, watching, and flowing when the moment was right. So the settlers began to slow their lives. They worked by the rhythm of water. They planted when the soil grew damp. They traveled when the current calmed. They listened when the world grew quiet. The wasteland, so often filled with violence and fear, felt gentler here. As weeks passed, the settlers grew fond of a ritual. At dusk, each would cast a small stick or leaf into the current. They would watch as the river took it, drifting away into darkness. They called this the carrying of dreams, for each item symbolized something they longed for: a home, a friend, a memory of music. They did not speak these dreams aloud. They let the river hold them, knowing it would carry them further than their feet could walk. Children laughed as their leaves raced one another. Elders stood in silence, imagining their dreams sailing toward horizons unseen. Perhaps no dream would ever reach its end, but still the ritual brought peace. For in a world of broken roads, it was enough to know the river still traveled. So ends this chapter of the Wasteland's quiet memory. A river without name, a current without master, a song that endures even when towns are drowned and bridges fall. For the Vault 76 settlers, the river was more than water. It was teacher, healer, witness, and companion. It reminded them that the world was not static ruin, but moving story. That even in destruction, something flowed forward, always forward. And perhaps, when the wasteland itself has forgotten the war, the river will still be here, carrying its endless memory, carrying the dreams of those who once stood at its shore. Beyond rivers, beyond crumbling towns, lie the forests of the wasteland, spaces often overlooked, yet full of stories that move more slowly than fire or steel. Here, trees stand in patient rows, their bark scarred and sun-bleached, leaves rustling like soft whispers in the wind. They carry history differently than rivers do. Rivers move, forests remember. The Vault 76 settlers reached one such woodland after several days of travel. The air felt different immediately. It smelled of sap and soil, muted by the lingering dust of distant ruins. Branches filtered sunlight into delicate patterns on the ground, and in that dappled glow, shadows became gentle companions, rather than ominous threats. Even the smallest animals, rabbits, birds, insects, seemed to pause, watching, listening. Mara, the teacher, led the group cautiously along a narrow path, fallen logs marking the edges. She pointed out trees with rings wider than her arm could encircle, and others bent by storms long past. Each tree, she explained, was a marker of time, a living ledger that could teach patience in a world accustomed to hurry. In these forests, survival demanded attentiveness. Branches blocked paths. Roots tripped the unwary. Water pooled in shaded hollows, stagnant unless gently diverted. The settlers moved slowly, learning to tend not just themselves, but the spaces they passed through. They cleared trails with careful sweeps of saw and hand, removed debris that could smother new growth, and marked clearings where future travelers might camp safely. Every task was measured and deliberate. There was no rush. Every gesture mattered. The placement of a log, the sweep of a fallen leaf, the observation of animal tracks. These small acts of care echoed the practices of the first clergy. Just as a lantern was tended in a ruined chapel, here too life was tended with mindfulness, patience, and quiet reverence. The forest offered lessons in rhythm. The settlers learned to pause, to let the wind settle, to allow sunlight to reach seedlings. In this patience, there was an understated joy. Growth, even slow and imperceptible, was a kind of miracle in the wasteland. Among the trees, the settlers found remnants of a forgotten people. A rusted swing hung from a thick branch. An old treehouse leaned precariously against a trunk, its boards scarred by weather. Pieces of broken glass caught the sun, reflecting faint rainbows onto the forest floor. Each object held no immediate danger, only memory. They became quiet prompts for storytelling. Children asked questions, which elders answered gently, weaving imagined tales of those who had played there before the war. Sometimes the stories merged fact and speculation, but the act of remembrance was itself grounding. In one glade, Mara uncovered a stone circle partially overgrown with moss. Its stones were smooth and heavy, carved in patterns worn by rain and sun. No one could say who had built it, nor for what purpose, but its placement suggested ritual, small human attempts to mark meaning in the landscape. The settlers sat in the circle, feeling the hush of centuries around them, and it became a place for reflection, a quiet cathedral without walls. Animals moved with ease among the trees. Birds alighted on branches, shaking their feathers in the morning light. A fox slinked along a fallen log, pausing to observe the humans with mild curiosity. Even the wind seemed to slow here, bending around trunks and leaves rather than whipping through empty plains. The settlers came to understand that the forest listened. It absorbed footsteps, soft words, even whispered worries. They left offerings in the soil, scraps of cloth, polished stones, small carved figures, gestures of respect for a space that had endured far longer than any human presence. And the forest, in its way, responded. Seedlings sprouted along cleared paths. Hollow logs provided homes for small creatures. Fallen branches rotted slowly, feeding the soil. Life and memory intertwined seamlessly, quietly, without spectacle. The interplay of light and shadow became a ritual itself. Settlers would wake early to trace the patterns of the sun through the canopy, noting where light touched the ground at different hours. They moved their sleeping spots, their campsites, even their small vegetable patches to follow the sun's arc. It was not survival alone that guided these decisions. It was attentiveness, a quiet practice of observation, and an acknowledgement that even in the post-war world, cycles of growth persisted. They began to note the presence of certain mushrooms and plants, not just for food, but for knowledge. Each observation recorded in small notebooks or on scraps of metal. Every detail mattered. In doing so, they became part of the forest's memory, adding a layer of care to its ancient continuity. One afternoon, Mara led a small group off the main trail. Beneath a knotted mass of roots, they discovered a spring. Its water was clear and cool, rippling over stones smoothed by centuries. The sound was gentle, rhythmic, a mirror of the river's voice but intimate, contained. They gathered quietly, filling bottles and letting children wash their hands and faces. No one spoke more than necessary. The moment was a communion with a space older than the wasteland itself. This spring, like the river, carried memory. It was a reminder that even amidst decay, sources of life endure. Its quiet strength reinforced the settlers' understanding of patience, rhythm, and care. Along the forest trails, subtle footprints appeared. Deer, rabbits, foxes, and occasionally the heavier tread of bears or wolves. The settlers noted these without fear, tracking the creatures lightly, observing the patterns of movement. They began to see that the wasteland's life persisted alongside theirs. Even in an environment stripped of civilization, other beings adapted. The settlers learned coexistence, silent, attentive, reciprocal. In doing so, they rehearsed lessons of competence and kindness that the first clergy had embodied. Care extended outward, beyond humans to all beings in a shared world. As dusk approached, the forest transformed. Light dimmed slowly, settling the land into shades of grey and green. Fires were lit in small pits, circles of stones containing warmth and smoke. Settlers sat quietly, sharing simple meals and listening to the faint hum of insects beginning their night. Children rested against fallen logs, eyelids heavy. Elders traced patterns in the dirt, reflecting on the day's observations. Mara hummed softly, not a song but a pattern of notes, echoing the cadence of earlier voices. The songmother, the shepherd, the unseen hands that had guided past generations. The forest embraced them in shadow and sound. It offered a gentle enclosure for rest. Forests, like rivers, are teachers of patience. They show that memory persists in quiet forms. Bark, root, leaf, water. They do not rush to remind, but they hold their knowledge in every branch and stone. The settlers' time here strengthens the thread connecting past and present. They learn to move slowly, to observe carefully, to act with purpose. In doing so, they carry the memory of the first clergy, not through words alone, but through gestures of care, rituals of attention, and the conscious preservation of life. And as night settles, leaves rustling softly in the wind, the settlers understand that they are part of a continuum. The forests remember, the rivers remember, and now so too do they. In the next chapter, the focus will shift toward the roads between these quiet places, the forgotten paths and small settlements that hold fragments of human persistence, linking the rivers, the chapels, and the forests into a broader story of endurance. Giant Amar, the wasteland, roads are more than asphalt or stone. They are traces of journeys once taken, reminders of where people have been, and subtle invitations to consider where they might go next. Some are barely recognizable now, cracked and overgrown, overlaid with sand or grass, dotted with debris. Yet they persist, stubbornly holding a memory of motion. The Vault 76 settlers followed one such road after leaving the forest. It was partially sunken, edges eroded by wind and rain, lined with skeletons of signposts that once marked directions to towns, shops, and stations. In some places, tires and rusted vehicles had been abandoned, their shells half swallowed by soil. The settlers moved carefully, noting not only where the road led, but how it had endured, where life had adapted alongside it. For them, the road was a classroom. Each turn, each bend, carried lessons in observation and patience. Tracks in the dust revealed the passage of animals and occasional humans. They learned to read subtle cues, the faint scrape of metal on stone, the scuff of boots, the flattened grass signaling a temporary campsite. These were not threats. They were stories, layered in quiet complexity. Mara and a small group paused at an intersection where the road split into 3 directions. Old maps, yellowed and torn, offered few answers. Yet even a blank map can teach if one learns to read the signs present on the land itself. They marked not only distances and destinations, but the nature of each path. One led to a shallow creek lined with moss-covered stones, a possible water source. Another wound into a cluster of ruined warehouses, offering shelter but no safety guarantees. The third curved toward a ridge where sunlight fell on scattered cabins, their roofs caved in, walls leaning outward. In marking these routes, they performed an act of quiet stewardship. The roads were no longer just corridors. They became repositories of memory, holding information for those who would follow. By observing carefully, noting, and recording, they extended the continuity of knowledge across generations. Along the road, the settlers encountered others, few and far between, but notable for the traces they left. A scavenger's pack leaned against a fence post containing simple tools, a hammer, nails, a length of rope. A lone wanderer had left a small bundle of coins and a note. We travel lightly. Carry what you can, leave what you cannot. These encounters were fleeting but instructive. They revealed a silent network of care. People passed along paths not only to reach destinations, but to leave markers of guidance or caution. The wasteland, despite its desolation, had channels of quiet communication. Each footprint, each object left behind, contributed to the broader memory of those who walked before. The settlers began adopting these practices. They left small markers of their own, a carved arrow on a post, a painted stone pointing toward a clean spring, a bundle of dried herbs for someone who might need them. In doing so, the road became more than a path. It became a shared ritual of care. The sun burned overhead, low and pale, and the wind carried dust from distant plains. The settlers observed the subtle changes in the road over time. Small erosion patterns, shifting sand, the growth of resilient weeds in cracks. They adjusted their pace according to these rhythms. Movement was measured. Rest was intentional. Meals were taken under scattered trees or behind collapsed walls. Water was collected and rationed carefully. Observation became a meditation, a form of competence as essential as food or shelter. Even the weather offered lessons. Rain softened the dust, revealing hidden tracks. Fog blurred familiar landmarks, inviting patience and attentive listening. These moments of subtle change encouraged humility, a recognition that the wasteland was vast, indifferent, and full of quiet complexity. The road passed through remnants of settlements. One small town had only a handful of standing structures, a half-collapsed diner, a store with its windows boarded, a post office whose mailbox leaned at a precarious angle. The settlers moved carefully, exploring without haste. They catalogued signs of prior life. A chair turned on its side, letters scattered and brittle, a small doll propped in a window. Each object offered a story, though incomplete. The act of observing became an act of preservation. In one building, Mara found a journal, water-stained but legible. It contained records of meals, weather, and occasional thoughts of a survivor long gone. The entries were mundane, yet profound in their continuity. They reminded Mara that even small, ordinary gestures of care could echo across decades. The settlers left markers of their own, noting safe routes and highlighting hazards. They tended broken paths, arranged fallen boards into temporary bridges, and in subtle ways, repaired both function and memory. As evening approached, the road narrowed beneath overhanging trees and rusted metal signs. Shadows lengthened, and the air grew cool. Fires were lit in small pits, their smoke curling into the sky and mingling with the last light of the sun. Settlers sat quietly, sharing minimal conversation. They traced patterns in the dust, noting footprints, leaf arrangements, and scattered debris. These observations became part of their nightly ritual. Each day on the road contributed to an ongoing ledger, a meditation on movement, memory, and the gentle act of caring for both self and landscape. Children rested, eyelids heavy with fatigue and wonder. Elders hummed simple melodies, echoing prior generations. The songs softened and slowed to match the rhythm of the road. The road itself seemed to embrace them in shadow and sound. Each step taken carefully, each breath measured, each observation stored. These were the new rites of passage in the Wasteland. By the end of the 5th day, the settlers understood a quiet truth. Roads are not simply connectors of places. They are connectors of people, past and present, each individual leaving traces to guide those who come next. Through attentive movement, mindful care, and the preservation of small stories, the road became more than a path. It became a conduit of history, a living record. Travelers who followed would find markers, notes, and gestures of kindness along the way, echoing the principles first demonstrated by the clergy. Even in decay, continuity persists. The asphalt, cracked and overgrown, still carries memory. The bridges, the posts, the scattered ruins, all tell stories to those willing to observe. The road teaches patience, humility, and quiet competence. The wasteland is often seen as a place of endings. Yet here, along these forgotten roads, beginnings quietly persist. Travelers are guided not only by what they see, but by what has been left behind. Each footprint, each marker, each small act of care links generations, weaving a subtle tapestry of endurance. In the coming chapter, the settlers will arrive at one of these quiet settlements, a place where the memory of the first clergy is tangible, where rituals of care and competence become formalized, and where the lantern motif returns. For now, the roads continue to stretch onward. The sun dips behind distant ridges, dust swirls gently in the cool evening air, and the settlers, walking slowly, observing carefully, carry with them the quiet, steady heartbeat of the wasteland itself. Settlements in the wasteland are not cities, nor bustling towns, but islands of careful presence amid an expanse of ruins and silence. They exist where someone has chosen to pause, to nurture, to rebuild. Each settlement carries the imprint of those who came before, and those who tend it now do so with quiet hands and deliberate attention. Vault 76 survivors arrived at one such place after several days on the roads. The settlement was small, half a dozen structures arranged around a central well, but every detail spoke of care. Fences leaned where needed, paths were swept clear of debris, and patches of cultivated soil displayed modest crops. Hardy greens, small root vegetables, and herbs that could survive the unpredictable climate. The settlers moved slowly, absorbing the rhythm of the place. Mara noted the precision of every arrangement. Simple routines, watering, sweeping, stacking firewood, were performed not with haste, but with the intent to preserve the continuity of life. Even the animals, wary at first, accepted human presence as a part of their own pattern. Chickens wandered the yard, foxes patrolled the edges, and birds nested in the eaves. The central courtyard was humble. A stone well stood at its heart, worn smooth from decades of use. The settlers knelt to inspect its pulley, greasing the wheel, replacing frayed ropes, ensuring the water could flow unimpeded. Mara explained that tending infrastructure, however mundane, was as sacred as any ritual. Care is a prayer, she said, and competence is its hymn. Children were given small tasks. They carried water, swept paths, or collected herbs. Each act reinforced the quiet principle: everyone contributes, everyone preserves. The rhythm of these shared duties wove them into the fabric of the settlement, connecting hands and hearts through small gestures repeated daily. Among the ruins of the settlement, fragments suggested that someone had once been a cleric. A carved wooden symbol leaned against a wall. Faded inscriptions were etched into door frames. Mara found an old journal, brittle and yellowed, filled with lists of chores, notes about weather, and reminders to tend wells and fires. Nothing grand, nothing ceremonial. But these mundane records carried weight. They represented an ethos that the first clergy of the Wasteland had cultivated: faith through care, ritual in repetition, and guidance through example rather than command. Each note, each symbol, each small correction of a leaning post contributed to continuity and safety. The settlers read these signs carefully, learning that stewardship, quiet, competent, attentive, is itself a legacy. The survivors extended the settlement gradually, always respecting the balance they observed. They patched walls, repaired roofs, and constructed small benches. Nothing was rushed. Every decision was weighed for its long-term impact. A misaligned beam might create hazard later. A misplanted seed could fail to thrive. Attention to detail became their guiding principle. They also observed communal patterns, meal times, work shifts, and rest periods. The settlement had rhythms, invisible yet persistent, which allowed people to coexist without strain. Even disagreements were managed calmly, often resolved through shared labor rather than argument. These routines became an anchor, a soft scaffold for the life they were reconstructing. Water was always central. The well had been repaired, but rainwater collection remained vital. Tanks were emptied and scrubbed, channels cleared. Small filters were made from cloth and sand, each layer carefully tended to prevent contamination. Fire, too, required diligence. Hearths were swept, smoke carefully directed, wood stacked in order of dryness. The flame was more than heat. It was a rhythm that marked day and night. Lanterns provided soft illumination. The settlers polished the glass, replaced wicks, and placed them at strategic points: the well, entrances, corners of communal spaces. Light became a guide, a gentle signal of presence, and a comfort to travelers arriving after long hours on the road. Occasionally, travelers arrived. They brought news, small gifts, or trade items. Each visitor was observed, welcomed, and guided without fuss. Settlers had learned that safety does not require isolation, but attentiveness. Interaction became a subtle ritual: greet, exchange, observe, and then continue. These moments reinforced a broader understanding. Settlements are nodes of trust, stitched into the wasteland by hands both visible and invisible. A lantern left at a doorway, a cleared path, a small offering in the dirt. Each action signals that care exists here, that memory is preserved, and that continuity matters. As dusk approached, the settlement slowed. Fires glowed in hearths. Children settled into beds, lulled by the rhythm of water and wind through trees. Elders reviewed their notes, and Mara hummed the melody of a distant river, the pattern echoing the rhythms of forest and road. The courtyard filled with shadow and gentle warmth. The act of tending, repeated across generations and settlements, created a resonance. It was not a story of conquest or survival in the usual sense. It was a story of presence, careful and continuous, a living testament to the possibility of gentleness amidst a landscape of desolation. The settlers reflected on what had been inherited and what they might leave behind. Small acts of care, well-placed markers, reminders of the past clergy, and above all, a commitment to continue, day by day, task by task. Settlements are the quiet hearts of the wasteland. They are composed not of grandeur, but of competence, attention, and care. In these small islands of life, the lessons of rivers, forests, and roads coalesce. The lantern at a doorway, the well-tended fire, the recorded observation, all of these are threads connecting past to present, shaping a future still uncertain but guided by mindfulness. Each hand contributes, each act preserves memory, and the settlement becomes a repository of quiet continuity. The next chapter will explore the people themselves, how individuals, in their small gestures, embody the ethos of the wasteland clergy, shaping the culture of care and observation that allows settlements to endure. In the wasteland, people are both witnesses and caretakers. Among ruins, forests, and forgotten roads, the individuals who linger do so with purpose, not spectacle. Their presence is gentle, attentive, and measured. The Vault 76 settlers, having established routines along rivers, forests, and settlements, now turn their attention toward understanding one another and themselves within this fragile continuity. Faces in this context are maps of experience. Lines etched by sun and wind tell stories of patience and endurance. Eyes reflect not only current thought, but the accumulated memory of long days spent observing, tending, and remembering. Mara encouraged the settlers to look closely, not to judge, but to learn. Every glance, every expression offers insight into character, into capability, into quiet competence. The children were especially attentive. They noticed the small gestures, the way an elder carefully stacked firewood, the precision with which a hand swept dust from a table, the soft hum accompanying repeated tasks. To the young, these acts appeared simple, yet they were rituals, teaching values that words alone could not convey. Each day unfolded with subtle regularity. Mornings began with gentle inspection, water sources checked, paths cleared, animals fed. Midday brought communal tasks, repairing walls, tending crops, cataloguing observations. Evenings were moments of reflection, recording knowledge, and sharing stories that reinforced the culture of care. No act was trivial. Each movement, however small, was considered a thread in the larger fabric of the community. These threads connected people to the land, to each other, and to the memory of those who had come before. In observing one another, settlers learned empathy, patience, and the quiet power of competence. One of the youngest settlers, a boy named Elias, discovered that simply noting animal tracks in a journal encouraged attentive care in others. Children mirrored elders, and elders mirrored one another, creating a feedback loop of observation and reflection. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly effective. Sometimes the most important lessons came from silence. Settlers watched as a fox crossed a field, noticing how it navigated obstacles. They observed the slow growth of a sapling or the subtle shift of water along a stone-lined channel. Each quiet moment reinforced the principle that life endures not through force, but through careful attention and adaptation. Mara often reminded the settlers, competence is a quiet force. It does not announce itself, but it protects, sustains, and teaches. These words became a refrain, whispered in the morning breeze, hummed over the evening fire, and carried along the edges of the settlement paths. The settlers learned to recognize subtle signs in one another. A glance toward a damaged fence indicated concern. A softly spoken word carried reassurance. Gestures, repeated and deliberate, became a shared language. Faces were not simply seen, they were read, understood, and respected. Alongside these interpersonal lessons, the settlers maintained physical markers of care. Notes were left on doorframes, stones arranged in patterns, and small offerings placed near wells or along paths. These markers were not symbols of dominance, but of continuity, a gentle acknowledgement of those who came before and those who would follow. Each act reinforced the quiet culture that had begun with the first clergy. Care, attentiveness, and competence were not abstract ideals. They were daily practices embodied in movement, expression, and ritual. Faces became vessels for these principles, and through observation, settlers internalized lessons that no written record could fully convey. Even in solitude, the settlers cultivated attentiveness. Mara guided moments of reflection, breathing slowly, observing surroundings, and noting patterns in the land. These practices reinforced a sense of calm and a subtle awareness that each person contributes to the collective memory of the wasteland. Children often practiced mimicry, imitating gestures of care, stacking stones carefully, feeding animals with patience, sweeping paths with mindful rhythm. Adults observed without interruption, allowing the young to internalize the lessons at their own pace. This interplay between generations ensured that knowledge passed gently, without coercion, and with enduring respect. At dusk, the settlement became a mosaic of shadows and light. Lanterns were lit, fires tended, and murmurs of reflection passed quietly through the air. Settlers reviewed their day's observations, the placement of stones, the state of crops, the condition of animals, and the subtle gestures of one another. Mara encouraged writing, sketching, and cataloguing, emphasizing that these acts preserve knowledge for future travelers and generations. Each observation, no matter how small, became a thread connecting past, present, and future. Faces of the quiet, those who observe, tend, and reflect, became central to this continuity, embodying the ethos of care that sustains life in the wasteland. The wasteland is often portrayed as a place of loss and chaos, yet in these settlements, among these faces, endurance and care persist. Every glance, every gesture, every small act of attention becomes a lesson in competence and compassion. The settlers learned that survival is not merely physical, it is relational, ethical, and ritualized. As night deepens, lantern light dances across faces lined by experience and softened by care. The settlers lie down to rest, carrying with them the quiet knowledge of observation, competence, and attentiveness. These are the lessons that will guide them forward, shaping their journeys along rivers, forests, and roads, and in turn, the wasteland itself. The next chapter will follow the rhythm of routine, exploring the daily rituals that tie settlers to the land, and how these practices preserve memory, culture, and continuity without haste or alarm. Routine in the wasteland is a quiet form of survival. Beyond immediate needs of food, water, and shelter, the Vault 76 settlers discovered that repeated practices, small, deliberate, and measured, sustain memory, community, and inner calm. These were not mere chores. They were rituals, subtle and deliberate, performed with intention and care. Morning light filtered softly through the cracks of settlement roofs. Children stirred first, carrying buckets to the well or sweeping fallen leaves from paths. Elders moved slowly, checking water levels, adjusting fires, and inspecting the condition of stored provisions. Every act, no matter how ordinary, carried weight because it was observed, repeated, and refined. Mara encouraged the settlers to approach these tasks as both work and meditation. Sweeping dust became an exercise in awareness. Repairing a fence or patching a roof became an acknowledgement of the past clergy, whose ethos emphasized competence as a spiritual practice. Through repetition, settlers learned patience, precision, and mindfulness, which were as vital as food or fire. Each ritual had a rhythm: morning inspection, midday maintenance, evening reflection. These sequences anchored the day. Observers noted not only what was done, but how it was done: the placement of tools, the flow of water, the alignment of stones. These details mattered, for subtle misalignment could ripple across time, and attentive hands ensured continuity. Even the smallest gestures, adjusting a lantern wick, stacking firewood by size, recording plant growth, taught principles of foresight. Children were encouraged to participate, guided gently, their mistakes reframed as lessons rather than failures. In this rhythm, learning became intuitive, embedded in motion and observation rather than instruction alone. Settlers discovered that rituals also shaped attention. By observing repetition, they noticed patterns, shifts in weather, animal movements, and subtle changes in plant growth. Each observation was logged, sometimes written, sometimes remembered, adding to the shared memory of the settlement. Rituals were often tied to objects. A well-worn hammer, polished smooth from years of use, became a symbol of labor and continuity. A carefully stacked pile of stones indicated not just stability, but mindfulness. Lanterns, lit each evening, were more than sources of light. They marked presence, guided movement, and became symbols of shared responsibility. Even broken objects contributed. A rusted wheel repurposed as a planter held seeds, bridging the past and the present. A weathered journal recorded the smallest notes: water levels, wind direction, the number of birds nesting nearby. These anchors, physical and symbolic, reinforced lessons of observation, care, and patience. Settlers attuned themselves to the rhythms of the wasteland itself. Morning dew, shifting sunlight, rainfall, and wind became markers for action and reflection. They learned that nature follows its own routines, and human practices could harmonize with these patterns rather than compete against them. Each cycle was noted: the way leaves rustled differently after a night of rain, or how the creek's flow changed with the shifting sun. By aligning human rituals with natural cycles, settlers found a quiet sense of continuity, understanding that survival is inseparable from attention, adaptation, and care. Some practices were collective. Meals were shared at predictable times. Tools were cleaned and returned to their places together. Paths were swept in coordinated efforts, and small gatherings occurred to review observations or record lessons. These shared rituals strengthened both competence and trust, reinforcing the social fabric of the settlement. Even disagreements were mediated through ritualized consultation, a calm discussion, the gentle placement of hands on work surfaces, and shared observation of the natural world. The first clergy had emphasized that competence and ethical action form the backbone of community, and settlers mirrored these teachings in small, everyday gestures. The patience was central. Tasks were not rushed, and time was allowed for observation and reflection. The settlers learned to notice subtle details, the direction of a bird's flight, the growth pattern of a plant, the wear on a pathway. These observations became part of their ritual, recorded mentally or on paper, creating a living ledger of knowledge and care. Even simple acts, like preparing a meal or arranging firewood, were opportunities to practice mindfulness. Settlers found satisfaction in noticing, adjusting, and refining their movements, understanding that continuity is as much about attention as it is about action. As dusk settled, fires glowed in hearths, lanterns illuminated doorways, and the settlement exhaled into quiet. Settlers reviewed the day's rituals, what had been observed, repaired, tended, or recorded. Notes were compared, small corrections made, and children were reminded of lessons embedded in their tasks. Mara often led these reflections, encouraging soft speech and careful observation. Each gesture matters, she reminded them. Each act of care ripples outward, connecting us to those who came before and those who will come after. The cadence of ritual became a bridge across generations, a silent promise that knowledge, competence, and care endure. Rituals of continuity transform ordinary actions into a form of meditation, ethics, and memory. In these repeated, attentive practices, settlers experience calm, focus, and the quiet power of competence. They learn that survival in the wasteland is not merely physical, but relational and observational. Night deepens, lantern light softens, and the settlement settles into silence. Each face, each hand, each gesture carries the lessons of river, forest, road, and settlement forward. In tomorrow's tasks and the next day's observations, continuity persists, quietly and intentionally, sustaining both place and people. In the next chapter, the narrative will trace the subtle mysteries that emerge from these routines, patterns and anomalies in the wasteland that encourage observation, reflection, and gentle inquiry without alarm. In the wasteland, patterns appear quietly, often unnoticed until one learns to observe. Tracks in sand, the arrangement of stones, the flow of water, and even subtle repetitions in human activity can suggest meaning beyond the immediate. These whispers among patterns do not demand fear or urgency. They offer guidance, insight, and gentle. Curiosity, the vault. 76 settlers had grown attuned to these rhythms. Walking along roads, crossing fields, and moving through settlements, they observed recurring signs. A trail of feathers near a creek, the alignment of sun-bleached planks across multiple buildings, the predictable nesting of birds in certain eaves. To the casual eye, these were minor details. To the practiced observer, they formed a living map, a guide to both safety and understanding. Mara encouraged the settlers to notice patterns without judgment. Patterns are stories written by the land and those who pass through it, she explained. Observe, and you learn not just where things are, but why they are. Children were taught to sketch, note, and quietly discuss what they saw. Observation became an act of respect, an acknowledgement of the wasteland's subtle order. One morning, the settlers followed a faint trail leading to a grove where wild herbs grew abundantly. At first glance, the trail seemed random, broken twigs, scattered stones, and slight depressions in the soil. But closer inspection revealed repetition, footprints returning along the same line, clusters of stones marking safe footing, and faint notches in tree bark serving as subtle signals. These repeated cues suggested previous visits by animals or humans and offered reassurance. They also taught a method of thinking. Patterns are rarely accidental. Each recurring mark is part of a dialogue with the environment, a gentle whisper urging observation, patience, and thoughtful response. Beyond the land itself, human actions carried patterns. In the settlement, daily rituals, fire tending, path sweeping, tool maintenance, created predictable sequences. These sequences were comforting. They allowed settlers to anticipate needs, understand behaviors, and notice anomalies without alarm. When something fell out of pattern, a basket left empty, water levels unrecorded, an animal behaving unusually, it was not treated as a crisis. Instead, it prompted careful inquiry, checking, measuring, and documenting. Settlers practiced the art of noticing without haste, of interpreting without panic. In this way, patterns became teachers, revealing both the ordinary and the exceptional in gentle, observational ways. Along the creek, Mara found small bundles, cloth tied carefully around herbs, pebbles stacked to form tiny arrows, and remnants of a journal page tucked beneath a stone. They were subtle, yet intentional, a language of care and guidance. Children were fascinated by these whispers. They traced the stone arrows, rearranged fallen branches to test alignment, and compared sketches of patterns with previous observations. Each discovery reinforced the principle that small, consistent actions leave lasting impressions. The land itself, like the settlers, participates in this continuity. Observation became a communal act. Groups would walk slowly along paths, noting the repetition of tracks, the direction of fallen leaves, or the alignment of structures in ruins. Softly, they compared notes. A whispered conjecture here, a gentle sketch there. No one dictated, no one demanded. Each person's perception added to the shared understanding. Through this shared attention, the settlers learned not only about the wasteland, but about each other. They noticed habits, gestures, and preferences, subtle markers that deepened empathy and strengthened trust. Faces, hands, and actions all became interconnected threads in the larger tapestry of settlement life. The rhythms of animals, plants, and water offered additional whispers. Birds returned to familiar perches. Foxes followed predictable routes. Streams altered their flow with the seasons. By watching, the settlers discovered ways to predict, prepare, and harmonize with natural cycles. Even subtle changes, a displaced stone, a broken twig, a sudden shift in wind, were noted with curiosity. Patterns were not immutable. They were living, adaptable, and instructive. Learning to read them required calm attention, patience, and a willingness to embrace the slow unfolding of information. As night descended, lanterns were lit, casting gentle light over paths and gardens. Settlers recorded their observations, updated notes on trails, and discussed the patterns discovered during the day. Children compared sketches. Adults reflected on small irregularities. And Mara reminded all that noticing without judgment is the first step toward understanding. The settlement exhaled into quiet. Each whispered pattern, each repeated observation reinforced continuity. Awareness became meditation, observation became knowledge, and small acts of care became guiding rituals. The wasteland is vast, unpredictable, and full of subtle order. By attending to whispers among patterns, settlers learned to navigate with confidence, to act with care, and to cultivate understanding without fear. Patterns teach, guide, and comfort, not through force, but through patient observation and gentle reflection. As the settlers drifted to sleep, the lessons of repetition, rhythm, and subtle cues carried with them. Tomorrow's tasks and discoveries would build upon these insights, linking past, present, and future. In the next chapter, the narrative will explore the unexpected ways that continuity and care manifest in encounters with wandering travelers, those who arrive quietly, leaving behind traces that challenge understanding and invite reflection. In the wasteland, travelers arrive quietly. Some move like whispers, their presence noted only in subtle shifts. A displaced stone, the soft scrape of boots, or a faint scent carried by the wind. Vault 76 settlers had grown accustomed to these arrivals, not with fear, but with attentive curiosity. Each visitor, each passerby, became part of the living rhythm of the land, leaving traces that invited observation, reflection, and gentle inquiry. The morning sun cast long shadows over the settlement as Mara led a small group to inspect the outer fences. A narrow trail diverged from the road, worn but deliberate. Footprints pressed lightly into soft soil suggested a pair of travelers, moving slowly, observing rather than demanding. The settlers paused, noting spacing, depth, and rhythm. Each detail was catalogued, every anomaly recorded with care. Children followed quietly, sketching patterns in the dirt, tracing the path with fingers, learning the art of observation. The rhythm of movement, steps measured, pauses deliberate, offered lessons in patience, in reading intention, and in understanding without intrusion. By midday, the travelers arrived. They carried simple packs, marked by the soft glow of wear and care. They greeted the settlement with a measured nod, offering no demands, only presence. Conversation unfolded slowly. Introductions, shared observations, and subtle questions about water, paths, and shelter. No words were hurried, no expectations imposed. Settlers learned that engagement is an art of observation as much as speech. Each participant contributed to a pattern of calm exchange, reinforcing the ethos that underlies all wasteland continuity: competence, attentiveness, and quiet respect. The travelers shared small gifts, dried herbs, notes on water sources, a carefully folded map of nearby paths. These tokens were practical and symbolic. They were gestures of trust, markers of connection, and whispers of guidance. In turn, settlers offered advice, subtle guidance, and markers for safe movement through the land. Observing visitors requires attention to both action and silence. Mara guided the group to notice what was said, what was left unsaid, and what small gestures conveyed. A hand resting on a tool, the placement of a pack, the soft scanning of the horizon, all communicated intentions and capabilities. The children, curious but calm, were reminded that interpretation is not judgment. Observation is learning. They practiced noting without acting, sketching impressions of motion and alignment, recognizing how subtle cues reveal patterns of behavior. Even laughter and smiles were studied, not to intrude, but to understand human rhythm and continuity. Travelers often left more than footprints: a bent branch, a stacked pile of stones, a faint mark in dust. These were gentle signals, guiding future settlers and observers. Mara explained that these acts were part of an unspoken network, a dialogue across time and space. Continuity is preserved not just in settlements or rituals, but in these ephemeral markers that connect people who may never meet directly. Settlers added their own markers in response. Small arrows carved into bark, herbs left near paths, notes tucked beneath stones. These gestures were not signs of control, but of stewardship. They reinforced that movement in the wasteland can be deliberate, respectful, and considerate. As dusk softened the settlement, travelers rested by the central fire. Lanterns were lit, casting warm circles of light. Conversation slowed to murmurs. Observations from the day were recorded, subtle patterns discussed, and small gifts carefully stored. Mara reminded the settlers, every visitor, every path, every mark is a lesson. Our role is not to dictate, but to observe, understand, and continue the rhythm of care. The children nodded, understanding that the world is stitched together by attentive eyes, steady hands, and thoughtful gestures. Even as travelers prepared to move on, the settlement remained calm. Footprints and markers persisted as quiet guidance connecting past, present, and future travelers. Observation, patience, and competence ensured that each journey contributed to the collective memory of the wasteland. Travelers, in the quiet, teach as much as they learn. Their presence emphasizes continuity, the power of careful observation, and the subtle art of connection. In the wasteland, survival is not only about food, water, or shelter. It is about awareness, attentiveness, and gentle engagement with both land and people. As night deepened, lanterns glowed, fires settled into soft embers, and the settlement exhaled into silence. The settlers, travelers, and landscape were woven together by patterns, markers, and rituals. Each step, each glance, each quiet gesture contributes to a living tapestry that preserves memory, care, and continuity. The road, the settlement, the patterns, and the faces of the quiet all converge in this rhythm, guiding those who come after. And as the wasteland rests beneath the stars, it offers a final, tender lesson. Presence, patience, and quiet competence endure. The wasteland remembers, not in grand monuments, but in the echoes of care. Each settlement, each path, each small gesture of attention reverberates quietly across time. By chapter 11, the settlers had learned that stewardship is less about control and more about presence, patience, and continuity. Mara often described it as listening with your hands, seeing with your attention. Morning arrived slowly. Lanterns dimmed from their nighttime glow, and dew settled softly on stone paths and wooden rooftops. Children rose to sweep, gather herbs, or water small garden plots. Adults checked wells, inspected firewood, and adjusted shelters to better align with the shifting sunlight. Even in routine, there was mindfulness. Each gesture mattered because it sustained not only life, but the rhythm that connected past, present, and future caretakers. Settlers observed the land itself as a collaborator. Small patterns, how wind shifted across fields, how birds selected branches, how water pooled after rainfall, were noted and recorded. Each observation became a lesson in gentle adaptation. Knowledge accumulated quietly, stored in journals, in memory, in the subtle rearrangement of stones or tools. Mara emphasized that every member of the settlement was a steward. Children, in their careful mimicry, learned that even small hands can preserve continuity. Adults guided them with soft instruction: how to place stones for a stable path, how to repair a fence without disturbing local growth, how to observe without rushing. Competence was not flaunted. It was demonstrated through consistent, attentive action. Even the travelers who passed through contributed. Footprints, discarded twigs arranged into patterns, a bent leaf, or a carefully folded note, all became part of the echo of stewardship. Settlers learned to recognize these traces not as disruption, but as communication across time and distance. Every interaction reinforced the principle that care and attention ripple outward, affecting more than the immediate moment. Daily routines persisted like gentle tides. Water was drawn from wells, filtered and stored. Fires were tended, tools polished and returned to their designated places. The repetition was neither monotonous nor forced. Instead, it became a rhythm, a quiet ritual that instilled calm and cultivated awareness. Children learned to participate without haste, observing elders stack firewood or arrange garden plots. They internalized lessons in patience, precision, and observation. Each act reinforced understanding that life in the wasteland is sustained through steady, deliberate care rather than force or urgency. Among the settlements, remnants of earlier caretakers remained. A carved post leaning at an angle, a journal partially hidden beneath stone, the faint pattern of bricks in a garden bed, all suggested that stewardship had long been a quiet, persistent practice. Mara encouraged the settlers to read these signs as lessons, not commands, but invitations to continue, refine, and preserve. Even subtle mistakes, misaligned boards, uneven soil, or miscounted seeds became instructive. They reminded settlers that observation and care must be ongoing, gentle, and deliberate. Learning is embedded in repetition, reflection, and patient correction. At sunset, shadows softened over the settlement. Lanterns were lit, fires glowed in hearths, and murmurs of reflection spread gently among the inhabitants. Settlers recorded observations, sketched patterns, and discussed subtle changes in the land or in the routines of travelers who had passed. Mara reminded them softly, "Our presence is stewardship. Our attention is legacy. Each hand, each glance, each note we leave ripples quietly, beyond what we can immediately see." Children repeated the phrase in whispers, internalizing its cadence and meaning, connecting care with observation and memory. Echoes of stewardship stretch beyond immediate perception. They reside in patterns left for those who follow, in the rhythm of repeated rituals and in the careful attention to land, animals, and one another. Continuity emerges from these quiet acts, binding past, present, and future in a soft tapestry of care. As the settlement exhaled into night, the lantern's glow softened. Children drifted into rest, elders reflected in silence, and Mara traced her fingers over journal pages, reading traces left by caretakers long before. Stewardship, she reminded them, is the quiet heartbeat of the wasteland, a pulse that persists through careful hands, attentive eyes, and deliberate, patient care. In the next chapter, the story will explore the subtle ceremonies and small gatherings that reinforce bonds among settlers, shaping culture and memory without the need for spectacle or urgency. As the wasteland stretches quietly under morning light, the Vault 76 settlement found new ways to gather and reflect. Circles of reflection were small, gentle assemblies where settlers came together, not to debate or enforce, but to observe, share, and remember. Each gathering became a quiet ritual, reinforcing the rhythms of care and attentiveness cultivated over months and years. The circle formed near the central fire pit, a soft hearth of warmth and light. Children sat cross-legged, elders positioned carefully on worn benches, and Mara stood slightly apart, observing the flow of conversation with measured attention. These circles were less about words and more about presence, the simple act of sitting together, noticing one another, and tracing the subtle echoes of the day. Settlers shared observations, patterns in the wind, the rippling of water in the creek, or the traces left by travelers on distant paths. Notes and sketches passed quietly from hand to hand, and small questions were posed, not to challenge, but to illuminate. "What did you notice about the fox tracks yesterday?" Mara would ask, and the children would whisper their findings, gestures and sketches complementing words. Reflection circles allowed settlers to see the wasteland anew through each other's eyes. Subtle details that one person overlooked were highlighted by another. A bent reed near the stream, the faded color of a flower, or a slight shift in sunlight through the canopy. Observation became communal, woven together like threads in a tapestry, strengthening both understanding and connection. Children learned to listen as much as to speak. When a seedling failed to thrive, or a small tool became misaligned, these moments were discussed with calm curiosity, focusing on patterns and lessons rather than blame. Each story, each observation, reinforced principles of competence, mindfulness, and careful adaptation. The settlers incorporated rituals into their reflections. A soft bell marked the beginning. Hands were rested gently on laps, and notes were opened slowly, each page handled with care. Stories of previous caretakers were recounted in subdued tones, not as heroic tales, but as demonstrations of skill, patience, and ethical attentiveness. Even pauses held significance. Silence allowed space for thought, for noticing subtle movements or the faint sounds of the wasteland. Wind through the trees, the distant murmur of water, or the quiet stirrings of nocturnal animals preparing to rest. In these pauses, settlers absorbed lessons without haste, integrating them into understanding rather than rushing toward conclusions. As circles formed regularly, patterns emerged. Settlers began to recognize the ebb and flow of conversation, the alignment of sketches, and even the natural pauses in discussion. These patterns became reassuring. They signaled continuity, reinforced learning, and created an unspoken rhythm that connected each participant to the group and to the land itself. Children mirrored elders' behaviors, how they held notes, traced sketches, or adjusted their seating to maintain comfort. Through repetition, gestures became ritualized, teaching attentiveness, empathy, and mindful observation without formal instruction. Reflection circles also served as repositories of memory. Small notations were made on scrap paper, leaves pressed between pages, or sketches tucked into journals. These items, while simple, became anchors for continuity, ensuring that knowledge and insight persisted across days, seasons, and even generations. Mara reminded the settlers gently, memory lives not just in writing, but in attention. Every careful glance, every sketch, every note carries understanding. Forward, children and adults alike began to appreciate that continuity is cumulative, built in small, deliberate increments, like stacking stones to form a path. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the settlement settled into gentle quiet. Fires were tended, lanterns softly illuminated paths, and whispers of reflection lingered in the air. Circles were disbanded, but their rhythm persisted. Gestures, sketches, and observations carried forward into evening tasks. Settlers noted how simple acts, returning a tool to its place, adjusting a stone, or observing a minor shift in a plant, resonated with lessons discussed in the circles. Learning, care, and attentiveness extended seamlessly from structured reflection into the everyday flow of life. Circles of reflection create a space where presence and observation converge. They strengthen memory, reinforce routines, and nurture understanding. In these quiet gatherings, settlers realize that continuity is both relational and ritualized, cultivated in shared attention and small acts of care. As night deepened, shadows softened across paths, and firelight glimmered gently on faces lined with experience. Settlers drifted to rest, carrying the quiet knowledge of shared observation, rhythmic reflection, and careful stewardship. The wasteland, vast and patient, held these lessons tenderly, ready to guide the next day's rhythms and the generations to follow. In the next chapter, the narrative will follow subtle challenges and gentle anomalies in the wasteland, small mysteries that invite observation, reflection, and patient understanding rather than alarm or haste. Even in the calm of the wasteland, subtle anomalies emerge. They are quiet irregularities, a trail slightly askew, a patch of soil unexpectedly damp, a stone displaced from its usual pattern. To the casual observer, these details might seem insignificant. To the settlers of Vault 76, they were invitations. Invitations to notice, to reflect, and to adapt with care. Morning light fell across the settlement in long, soft beams. Children traced paths with careful steps, observing tiny deviations in familiar routes. Adults inspected tools, structures, and gardens, noting small inconsistencies that hinted at changes in the environment or in previous patterns of movement. Each anomaly was recorded, sketched, or remembered, contributing to a living map of subtle guidance and understanding. Mara encouraged patience. Not every difference requires correction, she explained. Sometimes observation alone teaches more than action. Watch, note, and let understanding unfold at its own pace. This ethos shaped the way settlers approached anomalies, not as threats, but as gentle prompts for curiosity and reflection. Subtle anomalies are best understood against the backdrop of established patterns. Settlers compared new observations with previous records. Footprints, weather patterns, growth of plants, and alignment of pathways. A bent branch in a grove, once unnoticed, might reveal a recent passage. A shifted stone could indicate minor erosion or animal activity. Children learned to document with care, soft sketches, notes in journals, and whispered discussions. These small acts of observation became lessons in mindfulness, teaching that attentive eyes and steady hands preserve both knowledge and continuity. The anomalies themselves were not problems. They were stories waiting to be read. Settlers approached anomalies methodically. They walked the affected area, noted details, compared textures, and examined connections to familiar markers. Conversation was soft, careful, and deliberate. See the way this stone rests, one might say, and how the sunlight shifts over it by mid-morning. Could this indicate a subtle pattern we've not noticed before? Through this gentle investigation, each anomaly became an opportunity to deepen understanding. The wasteland, patient and vast, responded in small, observable ways. Streams shifted slightly with the morning sun. Animals adjusted paths. Leaves rustled differently in the wind. Each subtle change was a lesson in attention, causality, and careful adaptation. Subtle anomalies also reinforced communal bonds. Observations were shared in quiet circles, compared gently, and discussed with calm curiosity. Different perspectives revealed insights that solitary observation might miss. The trajectory of a fallen twig, the faint indentation of a pore, or the alignment of shadows at sunset. Through shared reflection, settlers learned that anomalies are neither dangerous nor alarming. They are a dialogue with the land, a guide to patience, awareness, and attentive action. Children and adults alike internalized the principle that continuity depends on noticing the small, unexpected details as part of a larger, gentle rhythm. In response to anomalies, daily rituals adapted subtly. Paths were re-examined, tools were slightly adjusted, and markers were repositioned to maintain continuity. These practices were never hurried or forced. They followed a calm cadence, reinforcing observation, learning, and careful intervention. Each act became part of a broader understanding. The wasteland is not static, and survival relies on gentle responsiveness rather than abrupt correction. Competence is shown in noticing, reflecting, and acting with consideration. Every small adjustment, every documented observation, strengthens the network of care that preserves the settlement's rhythm. As night approached, settlers gathered briefly to review their observations. Lanterns glowed softly, shadows stretching along familiar walls and pathways. Mara reminded them, every deviation, every irregularity is a lesson. It teaches patience, attention, and the value of mindful action. Children shared sketches, elders compared notes, and all participants listened with quiet attentiveness. In these circles, the subtle anomalies of the day became embedded in memory, reinforcing lessons of observation, continuity, and gentle adaptation. Subtle anomalies are not disruptions. They are invitations to look closer, think deeper, and act with care. In noticing the small irregularities of the wasteland, settlers cultivate awareness, patience, and continuity. Every footprint, every bent leaf, every faint whisper of wind becomes part of a living tapestry, connecting past, present, and future. Night settled over the settlement. Lanterns flickered softly. The air carried faint echoes of wind through leaves, and the settlers exhaled into calm. The wasteland's lessons, transmitted in small, quiet anomalies, offer guidance and reassurance. Attentive observation, careful reflection, and gentle action endure. The story concludes here, leaving the settlement and its caretakers cradled in continuity, mindful presence, and quiet stewardship. The wasteland carries its stories in threads, subtle, unbroken lines connecting past, present, and future. In Vault 76, settlers began to perceive these threads not as abstract concepts, but as tangible connections. The repeated bending of a reed, the alignment of stones, the flow of water along a worn path. Each thread was a whisper of continuity, a guide toward a careful, attentive living. Morning light filtered through the settlement's structures, softening edges and illuminating familiar patterns. Children moved quietly among the garden plots, following routines of watering, weeding, and observing the growth of seedlings. Adults tended tools, inspected shelters, and checked the alignment of paths. These daily rituals were deliberate acts of stewardship, reinforcing both habit and awareness. Mara guided the community to notice not just individual actions, but the interweaving of gestures, routines, and observations. Threads of continuity, she said, are everywhere. Each step you take, each note you record, each stone you place, contributes to a living tapestry. The settlers began to see patterns, linking daily tasks to broader lessons, realizing that small, consistent acts build a resilient and coherent whole. Threads appeared in subtle correlations. A fallen leaf indicated water flow. The placement of herbs suggested soil health. Footprints revealed passageways previously unnoticed. Observing these connections required patience and attention. Settlers learned that every action, no matter how minor, contributes to the larger rhythm of settlement life. Children sketched these patterns in notebooks, connecting images with lines and notes. Adults refined the practice, integrating observations with existing records. Each recorded detail, each reflected observation, strengthened the web of continuity, turning small, discrete actions into a broader understanding of both land and community. Settlers also discovered that threads exist in human interaction. Soft gestures, the placement of items, and the tone of shared observations conveyed information as clearly as words. Travelers, too, added their own threads, leaving subtle markers. A carefully placed stone, a folded leaf, or a faint note tucked beneath a post. Mara encouraged attentiveness to these human threads. Observing intention, rhythm, and care in others' actions cultivated empathy and understanding. Patterns became dialogues, small acts of attention forming quiet networks that bridged space and time. Daily routines adapted to reflect the weaving of these threads. Tools were cleaned and replaced consistently, garden plots were marked and tended, and paths were maintained with care. Each repetition reinforced awareness and demonstrated that continuity is cultivated through deliberate, mindful action. Settlers learned that even anomalies, once investigated and understood, become part of the threadwork. They were integrated gently, without haste, contributing to a resilient and adaptive tapestry of knowledge, observation, and care. As dusk fell, the settlement gathered briefly, reviewing observations, sketches, and notes. Lanterns cast a soft glow across journals, stones, and garden beds. Mara reminded the community that each thread of continuity, every small act, observation, and adjustment is a lesson in patience, awareness, and stewardship. Children shared the patterns they had noticed. Adults discussed subtle correlations, and all participants recognized that the threads of continuity connect not just actions, but intentions, observations, and shared memory. The rhythm of settlement life was enriched, deepened, and harmonized through these connections. Threads of continuity are invisible yet tangible, subtle yet persistent. By observing, documenting, and reflecting on them, settlers preserve not only knowledge, but also connection, empathy, and the rhythm of life in the wasteland. Each step, gesture, and sketch contributes to a quiet, enduring tapestry, linking generations and landscapes. As night settled, lanterns flickered, fires glowed warmly, and the settlement exhaled into calm. The threads of continuity stretched beyond immediate perception, guiding the next day's rhythms, the movements of travelers, and the unfolding of life in a wasteland shaped by care, patience, and mindful attention. In the wasteland, guardians are not always those who wield force, but those who preserve calm, continuity, and attentive care. Vault 76's settlers had become such guardians, quietly sustaining life and order through observation, gentle action, and deliberate rituals. Their presence was not a declaration of authority, but a commitment to stewardship, an enduring dedication to the land, to one another, and to the delicate threads connecting past, present, and future. Morning arrived softly, brushing rooftops and paths with golden light. Children moved quietly, tending gardens, observing animal tracks, and tracing the flow of water through shallow channels. Adults inspected structures, adjusted markers, and ensured that paths remained clear and accessible. Every action was mindful, measured, and deliberate, reinforcing the rhythms of continuity and the ethos of guardianship. Mara reminded them that guardianship is an ongoing practice. Quiet vigilance, she said, is not about control. It is about presence, observation, and care. It is the soft work that ensures life endures, that patterns remain intelligible, and that every subtle signal is noticed. Settlers internalized this philosophy, understanding that protection comes as much from attentiveness as from intervention. The settlement had grown sensitive to even the faintest irregularities. A shifted stone, an unusual trail, or a displaced branch prompted observation and reflection. Guardians did not rush to judgment. Instead, they recorded, compared, and interpreted with patience. Each anomaly became a gentle prompt, an opportunity to refine understanding, reinforce patterns, and nurture continuity. Children participated in these practices, learning to notice, sketch, and discuss small irregularities without alarm. Adults modeled attentive observation, demonstrating that careful, patient attention often resolves questions more effectively than force or haste. Through these practices, the wasteland itself seemed to respond, subtle movements of wildlife, the gentle sway of trees, and the flow of water reaffirmed the value of mindfulness. Daily routines had become rituals of quiet protection. Tools were maintained and returned. Pathways were kept orderly. Fires were tended and checked. Even minor tasks, stacking stones to mark safe passages, adjusting garden supports, or cataloguing observations, served as acts of guardianship, reinforcing both physical and cultural continuity. Settlers shared their reflections in soft circles, discussing patterns, anomalies, and the lessons learned from careful observation. Each conversation strengthened communal bonds, deepened empathy, and highlighted the enduring role of attentive care in sustaining life amidst the vastness of the wasteland. Guardianship extended beyond the settlement to the land itself. Observing changes in plant growth, water flow, and wildlife behavior allowed settlers to act in harmony with the environment. Adjustments were subtle, gentle, and adaptive, ensuring that human presence enhanced rather than disrupted natural rhythms. Mara reminded them that guardianship is reciprocal. Care given to the land is care received in return. Travelers who passed through became part of this network. Their traces, footprints, markers, and small gestures were observed, interpreted, and integrated into the settlement's understanding. The settlers' quiet attention ensured that every step taken in the wasteland by resident or visitor was acknowledged, preserved, and respected. As twilight deepened, the settlement exhaled into quiet. Lanterns flickered softly, fires glowed warmly, and shadows lengthened across familiar paths. Settlers recorded observations, shared insights, and reflected on the day's subtle lessons. Children repeated patterns in sketches, elders discussed anomalies, and all participants embraced the rhythm of guardianship, steady, attentive, and continuous. Mara concluded softly, guardianship is gentle, patient, and enduring. It is the quiet heartbeat of this place. Through observation, care, and mindful action, we ensure life flows steadily, patterns are preserved, and knowledge is passed forward. Guardians of quiet do not dominate or demand. They observe, reflect, and act with deliberate attention. They honor patterns, embrace subtle anomalies, and cultivate continuity across time and space. In Vault 76, the settlers had become living expressions of this philosophy, embodying attentive stewardship, careful observation, and the gentle preservation of life in the wasteland. As night fully descended, Lanterns glimmered, the wind whispered softly through leaves, and the settlement rested in calm assurance. Every action, every observation, every note and sketch became part of a living tapestry, a testament to the enduring power of quiet guardianship, mindful presence, and the unbroken rhythm of life in the wasteland. The wasteland sleeps, and with it, the guardians of Vault 76, cradled in continuity, care, and gentle observation.